Well, tonight we have a new reason, a new apparent reason why the January 6th committee rushed into that special session yesterday to hear the public testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson. They want the White House counsel. They want him. And that's why they had to have that hearing yesterday. Because Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony fully justified the subpoena to Trump White House counsel Pat Cipollone that the committee issued today. The last time a president was destroyed by a congressional investigation, the White House counsel was a key witness. Richard Nixon's White House counsel, John Dean, helped bring down the Nixon presidency with his testimony in the Watergate hearings. And now it looks like Pat Cipollone could be the witness who locks in Donald Trump's guilt for the January 6th committee. When presidents break the law, the White House counsel knows. The White House counsel's job is to prevent presidents from breaking the law, among other things. That is to say, prevent them from breaking the law intentionally or, as can happen, unintentionally. When someone in the White House has a bright idea, like banning all Muslims from entering the country, it is the White House counsel's job to say, we can't do that. That's unconstitutional. The White House counsel is not the president's personal lawyer. The White House counsel does not represent the president as a lawyer. The White House counsel represents the Constitution. The White House counsel is the defender of the Constitution, the principal defender of the Constitution in the White House. The White House counsel is the Constitution cop in the White House. The White House counsel also has other duties like advising on judicial appointments, but there is nothing in the White House counsel's work that is protected by the attorney-client privilege, with the client being the president. Some of the communication between the president and the White House counsel could arguably be protected by executive privilege as long as that president is still in office, but that executive privilege does not outlive the president's term in office. That does not mean that Pat Cipollone will not try to hide behind those privileges in response to the committee's subpoena. He's being ordered to testify exactly 1 week from now, and he has no legal right not to show up for that testimony. In response to certain questions, he might try to claim attorney-client privilege or executive privilege. Those will be legally false claims, but the committee doesn't really have the power to force him to answer those questions on the spot if he claims those false privileges. The privilege that Pat Cipollone does have, and that he might need to invoke, is the Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself in possible crimes that he may have committed. And here is one passage in Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony yesterday that gives Pat Cipollone a fully valid claim of his Fifth Amendment right not to answer the question that I would ask him about this testimony.
On January 3rd, Mr. Cipollone had approached me knowing that Mark had raised the prospect of going up to the Capitol on January 6th. Mr. Cipollone and I had a brief private conversation where he said to me, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. This would be legally a terrible idea for us. We have serious legal concerns if we go up to the Capitol that day. And he then urged me to continue relaying that to Mr. Meadows, because it's my understanding that Mr. Cipollone thought that Mr. Meadows was indeed pushing this along with the president.
And we understand, Ms. Hutchinson, that you also spoke to Mr. Cipollone on the morning of the 6th as you were about to go to the rally on the Ellipse. And Mr. Cipollone said something to you like, make sure the movement to the Capitol does not happen. Is that correct?
That's correct. I saw Mr. Cipollone right before I walked out onto West Exec that morning, and Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. We're going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we make that movement happen.
What do you mean, we? We? We are going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we make that movement happen. We are going to get charged. Mr. Cipollone, what do you mean we are going to get charged? What were you going to get charged with if Donald Trump went to the Capitol on January 6th?
In the days leading up to the 6th, we had conversations about potentially obstructing justice or defrauding the electoral count.
Let's hear about some of those concerns that you mentioned earlier in one of your interviews with us.
Having a private conversation with Pat late in the afternoon of the 3rd or the 4th, that Pat was concerned it would look like we were obstructing justice or obstructing the electoral college count. And I apologize for probably not being very firm with my legal terms here, but that it would look like we were obstructing what was happening on Capitol Hill. And he was also worried that it would look like we were inciting a riot or encouraging a riot to erupt on the Capitol, at the Capitol.
The committee wants to talk to Mr. Cipollone about more than that, much more than that. In their letter today to Pasquale Pat Cipollone, the committee told him they have questions about, quote, the submission of fake electoral ballots to Congress and the executive branch, the attempted appointment of Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general, and efforts to interfere with the congressional certification of the Electoral College results on January 6, 2021. The committee also revealed that Cipollone, quote, previously sat for an informal interview with the Select Committee on August 13, 2022. Pasquale Cipollone's father came to this country as an immigrant from Italy who Donald Trump would have prevented from entering the United States had Trump been in power at the time. Pat Cipollone's father worked in a factory. His mother was a homemaker. He lived in the Bronx as a child before his family moved to Kentucky, where he attended a Catholic high school and then a Catholic college. He was a leader of the right-wing Federalist Society at the University of Chicago Law School when he served as one of 3 clerks to a federal judge on the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. He helped to create the least intellectual atmosphere I've ever heard of in a federal appeals court judge's chambers. The New York Times reported in 2019, a fellow clerk, Jennifer Hall, recalled sitting in Judge Boggs's bookshelf-lined chambers between Mr. Cipollone and another clerk, Stephen Vaughn, now a trade lawyer in Washington. They would yell at each other over me, she recalled, listening to Rush Limbaugh. Pat Cipollone and his wife, who are close friends with Fox's Laura Ingraham, have 10 children. He was making a few $1 million a year as a lawyer before joining the Trump White House, and he is surely making at least that much now. The good news is Pat Cipollone is a lawyer, which means he knows that fighting this subpoena in court is hopeless. But the bad news is he's a ditto head. Rush Limbaugh fondly called his devoted audience ditto heads, meaning they just said ditto to everything, every crazy thing Rush Limbaugh said. Pat Cipollone is as hardcore conservative as anyone who worked in the Trump White House. He was part of the defense team in Donald Trump's first impeachment trial in the United States Senate. He saw nothing wrong with Donald Trump trying to extort Ukraine's President Zelensky by asking President Zelensky to smear Joe Biden in exchange for Donald Trump sending military aid to Ukraine. Pat Cipollone agreed with Donald Trump that his extortion phone call to President Zelensky was a perfect phone call. We learned today that Ali Alexander, who was involved in organizing the Trump rally on January 6th, that occurred before the attack on the Capitol, testified to a Washington, D.C. grand jury on Friday, which is just about 6 months after he testified in an 8-hour deposition to the January 6th committee. So Pat Cipollone knows that the Washington, D.C. grand jury is operating about 6 months behind the January 6th committee's investigation. So if he tries to fight this subpoena, he might be facing another one 6 months from now with no way out from that one.